Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
A weird thing happened when I was a kid. I was in the supermarket with my mom, specifically the cereal and spreads aisle. Of course, being a kid, I immediately run up to the sugary cereal section and start pleading with my mom to let me have some, with pleas that other kids are allowed to eat it, etc. My mom ignores this, and as I turn to lovingly glance at the cereal aisle one last time, something weird happened. The picture of the famous Trix the rabbit mascot, Trix, looked up at me, held eye contact, winked, then looked back down to the exploding bowl of cereal in the picture, pic related. Tell my mom, but she doesn't believe me. Ever since that day, I was scared shitless of Trix. He would feature in nightmares, and worst of all, when I tried to tell people of my experience, they thought I was crazy.
Man, that's kinda freaky, and I'm not gonna lie. Not really like the thousands of childhood ghost stories that are all vaguely similar, and you have to wonder if it really happened or not, since it's all the same story basically. This story is just straight up weird. The box art looked you in the eye and winked and then went back to normal. Almost sounds like a short from Toy Story.
It seemed like it was communicating with me directly in a way it always could, but chose not to. Nothing like that ever happened again, but I still can hardly look at those weird cereal mascots now without feeling like they are looking back at me.
You know, Anon, you reminded me I had a similar delusion when I was younger. When I was a very young child, I used to believe that cartoon characters were real actors that lived in a separate dimension from ours. However, what we say on TV wasn't something that was made for TV, but was more like reality TV. Like they didn't write or plan the episodes, it was just stuff that happened in their lives. I also assumed at some point that they were doing the exact same thing to us. They were also watching us for entertainment with invisible cameras. Growing up, I felt like I was always being watched by them, and I felt like I had to be entertaining for them. So I would just try to be entertaining. Making jokes, being stupid, kid stuff, even when no one was around. As I got older, I stopped believing that cartoon characters were actual people, but the delusion that I was being watched for entertainment purposes didn't. It led to me being a pretty loud and annoying kid and later teen at school, but nobody knew that I was doing all that shit to appease some delusion. I eventually stopped entirely, but I still feel like I'm being spied on sometimes.
Did something similar after seeing The Truman Show at age 8.
Yeah, when I watched that at around age 12. I wondered if it was some sort of meta-commentary on my life. I just sat there and watched and didn't know if I was supposed to act normal or make some kind of meta-joke about it. It's like I didn't actually believe it, but I still did a little just out of fear. I guess that I felt like so much weird shit had happened in my life that I wasn't entirely ruling out that it was all orchestrated by something. I guess at that moment I thought they were sending me a message, maybe. That there was nothing I could do about my reality, perhaps?
There is no doubt in my mind that this happened to you. Not a single doubt. Be careful, things like this happened to me as a child. It stopped for a while, and I lived until my 30s with complete normality. Now, I can't sleep, I can barely eat, I always feel watched. I hear strange things, see strange things. Transparent creatures lurking, approaching, then fading away. You might be fine, but I find the more you dig, the more you find, and what you find you won't like.
Reminded me of something when I was a kid, around 8 years old. Lived in duplex we think was haunted for a couple years. I have this 6 inches plastic gray alien toy my dad bought me. One day see the toy moving and looking at me from around the door corner. It retreats and I run into my parents' room where it backed off. It's standing right by the door. My mom is across the room asleep in bed. The thing is, I didn't hear my mom running or getting into bed if it was her, since I got there as soon as it got around the corner. I asked her multiple times throughout the years and she says she doesn't know what I'm talking about. That place was actually haunted though. I still have nightmares where I have to move back there and I hate the feeling.
Man, what is it about being a kid and being haunted by ghosts and other unexplainable shit? It's like they know you'll question if it really happened when you're older, so they do it when you're young to really screw with you. Also, that sounds like that sucked. I'm sorry, Anon.
I had all kinds of paranormal stuff happen to me as a kid that I wrote off in adulthood as just a kid having an active imagination. One quick example. Playing hide and seek with my cousin. Hide under kitchen table. Lights are off in kitchen. After waiting a couple of minutes, fluorescent green cartoon lizards appear in a writhing ball under the table with me. I scream and run out of the room. Can't remember if I told anybody about it at the time. A common occurrence was doors opening themselves after the door handle turned back and forth an unnecessary amount of times. A few years back I had an incident. The bit with the shaky door handle and a completely shut door opening at my house that both me and my wife witnessed. She actually heard footsteps in the hallway prior to the door handle rattling. I made a note to remember that neither one of us made it up and never to second guess the memory. I assume at least some of the stuff I remember as a kid actually happened.
Be me, 8th grade. When our science teacher was out, the sub was always the teacher who used to teach that class. He said it was something to do in his old age. In fact, he was our teacher's teacher. He had a weird energy to him. Not bad, not creepy, nothing like that. Just an aura of something being off. He was one of those guys that did crowd control of the students real well, could hype us up or calm us down at will. The sub seemed to take a liking to me for some reason. First time he subbed, he said, "I've never been asked a question in 30 years about my field of subject I couldn't answer." Students asking a bunch of questions, he gets each and every one instantly. Get to me. If the sky is blue because of the diffraction of shorter wavelengths being dominant, why isn't it purple? He actually couldn't answer the question and told me he'd Google it. Dude really took a liking to me after that. One day, middle of the year. He's in the middle of his lesson, he freezes. Whole class is silent. WTF? Walks over to the desk. It's important to mention that there were too few seats, so I sat in the back at the lab tables. Thus, I'm sitting a good 2 feet taller than everyone else. I have the best vantage point. He puts his hand in front of the desk. Massive bang. Snow globe on the teacher's desk slides forward, stops, then tips over exactly where his hand was. Whole class was astonished. He looks at me, winks, smiles, and continues on with the lesson as if nothing happened. All these years later, all the schizo shit I've seen, heard, I still don't have an explanation for what happened.
I was about 17 years old and living with my father in Globe, Arizona. We ended up going to Phoenix for my stepmother's doctor appointment for some specialist visit. I didn't pry as to what it was for. But I was 17 and my dad entrusted me to be able to float around by myself so long as I didn't go too awful far, so I figured I'd step outside and just take in the sights. I couldn't really speak with anyone because it's a pain being deaf in a heavily populated area, so I just went about my ways looking around and seeing the sights. And there I saw a statue of a Native American with a smoking pipe sitting on a block, one leg outstretched ahead of himself, the other bent with its foot on the ground and long pipe in hand. I just stared at the statue, rather fixated by its very detailed craftsmanship. I started shortly having a very uneasy feeling about the statue the longer I looked at it. It was very slow and very subtle, but I swear the statue was breathing.
We live in Richmond, Virginia. There are so many wonderful historical locations in our area, and I was determined that my young daughter would experience them all. One afternoon when she was about 2.5, we took the 45-minute drive to Jamestown State Park. At that time, the state park was a wide open field with a few historical markers, a historical church, and a statue of Pocahontas. I thought it was ideal because it would allow my daughter to run around till her heart's content. I figured that when she tuckered herself out, we'd have a nice lunch in Williamsburg and go home. Easy peasy, right? No. When we arrived at Jamestown State Park, we wandered around the courtyard of the church. My daughter became absorbed with the statue of Pocahontas for a few moments, and then we walked on. It was just her, the ranger, and I in the park, and it had no other visitors that day. I was happy to have the place to ourselves. I started walking toward the walkway thinking my daughter was right behind me. I turned around and noticed that my daughter had stopped walking. I thought that it was because she wanted to go back to the statue, so I said, "Look, Tatiana, let's go see the park." She still refused to budge. I took her by the little hand and started walking with her up the pathway toward the foundation markings of the original settlement. She suddenly stopped and refused to go any further. She turned her little face towards the James River. I told her we could take a quick walk around and then we could go have some lunch. She looked up at me with her big brown eyes and said, "Can't you hear the babies crying in the water?" She had such a look of concern on her tiny face that I did what every mom would do. I picked her up by the back of her overalls and carried her out of the park like a little purse, put her in the car, and peeled out of there. About a decade later, archaeologists discovered that a majority of the original Jamestown settlement had been reclaimed by the James River. I often wonder if it was the spirits of the settlers she was hearing, but her mind couldn't work out where the noise was coming from because that area is now covered by the water of the James.
I was 17 and it was during a holiday break from school. One morning I was lying in bed, watching my TV. My mother walked in and said that we were going to go canoeing on the Kissimmee River, and my aunt and cousin came along with us. I quickly got out of bed and we all headed out. When we got there, there was hardly anyone there and it was very breezy and colder than usual. It took my aunt and cousin almost 30 minutes to arrive. We grabbed 2 canoes from one of the rental places. My aunt, cousin, and I got in one canoe and were pushed off the shore first. My mom, dad, and sister were behind. Once they were in the water, we all started paddling. We had been on the water for about an hour enjoying the scenery and the time together, when I spotted something moving in the water. I looked down into the water and I saw a human figure swimming beneath us. The water was extremely shallow, and the figure moved in and out of the mangroves and weeds effortlessly. I looked closely and noticed that it was a young boy in his early teens with long blonde hair. I gasped in shock and fear, as my family heard me and showed concern. The boy looked at me with piercing red eyes. I sensed evil, as well as sadness. Upon seeing me, the boy turned his head and swam away into deeper water. Once I had realized what had just happened, I noticed that my family was around me. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" I nodded my head. "I'm just fine." When I gathered my senses, I thought that maybe I saw something else in the water, but it still scared me. "It was nothing," I replied. My mom said okay, and then we all continued with our sightseeing. But only a few minutes had passed, when something else occurred. I was looking all around, enjoying the scenery, when I saw the boy again. This time, I focused my eyes through the layers of thick mangrove trees and saw the boy staring back at me with a scowling, angry face. His large, bright red eyes were glaring back at me. I immediately got the feeling that we had passed through his territory and that we needed to get out of there as soon as possible. We had entered an open area of the river, but I was still focused on the boy in the mangrove. The wind started to pick up quickly and the temperature started to drop. My cousin was standing, taking a video of the area with her video camera. My aunt was holding her legs from behind. As I continued staring at the boy, the wind got worse. The boat tipped slightly, and my cousin lost her balance and fell into the water. I quickly looked away from the boy, as I watched my cousin tumble into the water. I stood and reached out my arm to her. Then I remembered the boy, and his evil expression. I looked back at the mangrove where I had seen him before. He wasn't there. I panicked. I needed to reach my cousin as soon as possible and pull her back on the boat. The boy was gone and I feared if he would do harm to my cousin. She was desperately trying to grab mine and my aunt's hands to get back on the boat. I was screaming loudly, "Get out! Get out!" She finally reached my hand and I quickly pulled her back into the boat. She was fine, but I was shaking and more upset than her. After a few minutes, I told everyone that I wanted to go back. I was worried for the remainder of our time on the water. When we finally got back to shore, I just happened to spot the boy again as he raised up in the low-hanging mangrove. He gave me a hideous wink and rolled his eyes back as he faded away. It made me shudder in horror. Suddenly I heard, "Ouch, my back hurts." My cousin was in pain and yelled out, just after the boy faded away. I lifted her shirt and to everyone's shock, her entire back was a huge black and blue bruise. Everywhere you looked on her back she had dark marks. "I don't even remember getting hurt," she said. "You must have hit a stump under the water or something?" I told her. I knew full well that the boy had something to do with it. My aunt was emotionally beside herself and insisted we go to the hospital so my cousin could be treated. Several years later, I returned to the canoe rental place. It was now a bait and tackle store with docks. I asked some of the men working on a boat motor about the history of the place after telling them of my previous experience there. They told me that many years ago a boy in his teens was playing around with his friends, in the same area where my family and I were canoeing. One of his friends placed a bet with him to see who could hold their breath the longest. The boy was from a poor family and wanted the money desperately. After they competed, the friend noticed that his partner was floating face down. When he touched him to tell him that he had won, there was no reaction. He quickly pulled him out of the water, then went to go get help. The poor boy had wanted the money so badly that he drowned in an attempt to hold his breath longer than his friend. When his parents learned of their son's death, they were so distraught that both committed self-end before the boy was buried. No one knew what happened to the boy's body. I walked toward one of the docks and looked out over the thick mangroves, and there he was. I clearly saw him standing there with his long blonde hair, looking at me with sorrow on his face. But this time he had light blue eyes. I smiled at him and then waved. I turned to walk away, quickly glancing back in his direction. The boy was gone, but I knew he'd be there forever.
I have one. When I was a kid, I had a surreal and terrifying experience watching a VHS of the special edition of Star Wars, A New Hope with my mom. I believe this was the late 90s, but I can't give an exact date, so I apologize. However, I was approximately 11 or 12. Basically, we were watching the part of the film where they're in the Death Star. At one point, when confronted by stormtroopers, Luke's nose suddenly extended grotesquely into a strange flesh-colored elephant's trunk. It then flailed around making elephant trumpet sounds, scaring the stormtroopers off. I vividly remember this, and I was absolutely terrified. My mom was really jarred and confused and trying to calm me down. Leia then says that's enough. Proboscis Luke and his nose returns to normal. The film also continued on as normal. Every subsequent viewing of our VHS was completely normal, as with every previous viewing. We had already watched the film multiple times prior to the incident, so that precludes it being some strange edited copy, which would be weird in and of itself. My mom still remembers the event, and sometimes we talk about it. It honestly feels somewhat demonic, like something was trying to fuck with us through the VHS.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.